talk about Ozark, known as St. Louis's hometown airline. So with that little preamble, if I can make the clicker here work, we had the usual hardware, software interface issues seemingly overcome, but we'll get rolling. So the story starts in 1943 when World War II was still raging everywhere globally, and the Civil Aeronautics Board, which regulated the U.S. airlines at that time, was already looking to a post-war air travel world, and it foresaw the need at that time for a new class of airlines, which they called local service airlines, which would act as feeders to the main trunk lines. One of the prospective operators was a gentleman named Laddie Hamilton, who was a bus operator, and his partner and financial expert was Floyd Jones. But Hamilton was a pilot and had trained pilots in World War II, and he thought it would be interesting to form a local service airline. So he went ahead and incorporated Ozark in 1943. Up on the screen there is a copy of his #1 stock certificate issued in September 1943. And there's Laddie with a nice DC-3 model on his desk, and there's his partner Floyd Jones. So they initially decided to do an intrastate operation, which did not require any regulatory approval. And so they started operating an intrastate service within the state of Missouri, got that going in 1945, and they were using initially a fleet of several stagger-wing Beech Model 17s. They also had a couple of twin-engine Cessna T-50 or Bamboo bombers, as they were colloquially known. This is the schedule that they operated on. They kind of started out making two round robins around the state, and they did that for a while in 1945, and of course made no money. You couldn't make any money carrying 4 passengers maximum in those planes, but they thought it would give them some experience in actual airline operations, and it did. So then, after the war ended, the CAB began accepting applications for local service airlines, and a very powerful rival to the Ozark Group immediately emerged in the form of Oliver Parks, the creator and operator of Parks College of Aeronautics on the east side. Parks had a very large and well-warranted reputation for excellence in aviation training and education, and that credibility that he had with the CAB was very valuable. So the CAB in 1946 awarded Parks several routes, and then Parks and Ozark went head-to-head in 1947 in the so-called Mississippi Valley case. The CAB decided in favor of Parks, as they had for some previous route packages, and so the Ozark group lost out. But then Mr. Parks encountered some problems along the way He did acquire a small fleet of DC-3s, initial cadre of pilots and support staff, but he had difficulty raising money. He was better at operating a school than securing financing. And so several years went by, and Parks was unable to get his airline up and running. So in 1950, the CAB initiated an investigation, and Parks tried several maneuvers to try to get going. Actually, for a very short time, did fly a few routes, but the CAB concluded that Parks didn't have the wherewithal, and remarkably enough, they withdrew his authorization and awarded most of those routes to Ozark. So now we had a situation where we had the two groups. The Parks group had airplanes, pilots, some support infrastructure, and Ozark had the routes and financing. And so there were obvious synergies to getting together, and the two groups agreed to merge. Parks acquired the block of Ozark stock, went on the board of directors, and Ozark got the planes and the pilots, with which they started operation in September 1950. Their first passenger, their first flight, one passenger only, a gentleman named Arthur Skinner, coincidentally a resident of Kirkwood. So Ozark got off to a fairly slow but steady period of growth in the early 1950s, and the city of St. Louis was encouraged to build a hangar and some office space for Ozark at Lambert Airport. Before that, they were still operating out of what was then downtown airport, the old Curtis Steinberg Airport across the river, part of the Parks legacy. So they now were able to centralize their operations at Lambert. And Ozark then went through a period of slow but steady growth during the 1950s. Gradually adding new routes with CAB approval, including in 1957, they extended north to Rochester and Minneapolis, with plenty of wintertime operation up there, as this picture depicts. And so that continued through the 50s. Then in 1959, Laddie Hamilton had some illness. He stepped down as the president of Ozark. And this gentleman, Joe Fitzgerald, who had been hired on as a kind of operations guy initially, came from the government. He became the second president of Ozark. Not a high-profile or well-known name, but he guided the airline for the next several years. Also in 1959, Ozark commissioned what would become their symbol for the rest of their existence, the Three Swallows logo, which was designed by an industrial designer here in St. Louis, Alan Sherman, and it actually won an award for industrial design, and it became really an integral part of Ozark's identity throughout the rest of its existence. So during the 1950s, the major airlines began adopting turbine and jet-powered equipment. The DC-3s largely World War II surplus C-47s, modified as airliners, a few even pre-war, were clearly not up to the same level of service. And so in 1958, before Hamilton stepped down, Ozark ordered 3 Fairchild F-27 twin turboprop, Dart turboprop engines, originally designed by Fokker in the Netherlands and built under license by Fairchild in the U.S. So Ozark started off with an order for 3 and had 3 of those. Eventually had, I think, a total of 6 or 7 F-27s. But then there arose a need for more suitable equipment to supplement the DC-3s and to kind of fill the gap between DC-3s and the F-27s with pressurized comfort and quiet turbine power. And so in 1962, Ozark acquired 4 Convair 240s from Condor Airlines of Germany, and somewhat amusingly, they were advertised as having zero-time engines, which to Ozark in the U.S., zero time is normally meant to understand that they have zero time since major overhaul. They're ready to go. Not so apparently in Germany. Zero time meant they had zero time left before. So Ozark acquired these planes that immediately required extensive and expensive upgrading. But anyway, they did incorporate the Convairs into their schedule and continued to increase the level of service they were able to offer in the early 1960s. Then in 1963, Mr. Fitzgerald resigned, went on to other business, and Floyd Jones took over for a while, initiated a search, and eventually found this guy, Tom Grace, who he hired, I believe, from Slick Airlines. But Grace was quite a different personality and a different businessman from Joe Fitzgerald. He was a very hard-driving, hard-charging guy, and he was determined to move Ozark ahead much more aggressively than it had during the 50s. So one of his early moves was to get rid of the Convairs. He swapped those with Mohawk Airlines for a fleet of Martin 404s, comparable planes, but more suited, evidently, to Ozark's operations. And those continued to provide the fill-in, the supplement between the turbine F-27s and the still serving DC-3s. Grace was also successful in getting the city of St. Louis to build Ozark a new facility, a large hangar and office building complex over on the south side of Lambert by the approach end to runway 6, which is rarely used these days. But that was to be Ozark's home for about the next 10 years, and very suitable for all of Ozark's needs, maintenance, business, etc. The big change and breakthrough during the Grace era was bringing Ozark into the jet age. Grace ordered initially 3 DC-9s from then Douglas, and the first of those was delivered in 1966. This picture was taken at the time that the airplane was delivered to St. Louis, and this Tom Grace is in the picture on the air stair, kind of hard to see, but he's in there, along with a number of the other operational and business people, celebrating the arrival of the DC-9 and jet service. Tom Grace also acquired a fleet of Fairchild FH-227s. The 227 was a stretch version of the F-27, had 2 more rows of seats, carried 48 people versus 40 for the F-27. It was very suited to Ozark's route structure. It was appropriate to fly into Chicago and Kansas City and other metropolises, and also could fly comfortably into Ozark's small, out-of-the-way airports. Eventually, Ozark had a fleet of 20 227s. Then finally in 1968 came the end of the DC-3 at Ozark, the aircraft that they'd start off with, like all of the other local service airlines. So October 1968 was the last DC-3 flight, and Ozark became an all-turbine airline at that point. But now the first real major change in the ownership and control of Ozark that took place. The process began in 1969 when Floyd Jones died. He was the major stockholder, had a huge block of stock, and he left that stock through, I think, both directly and through trust to the Lester Cox Memorial Hospital in Springfield, Missouri, and effectively giving Cox now Lester Cox control of the airline. Cox acquired some additional stock elsewhere, and so for the balance of Ozark's existence, the ownership and control rested with Lester Cox. To the right there, his left in the picture, is Ed Crane, who had been steadily moving up through the ranks at Ozark, was now the finance vice president, and had become really had been Grace's right-hand man, and was effectively now running the airline. Then Grace, rather suddenly, passed away in 1971 after a brief illness, and the board elected Ed Crane to be the president. And 1971 was also the year that Ozark adopted the advertising slogan, "Up there with the biggest," which I thought was a kind of appropriate title for the book, and as well as for the presentation. And it was on its way to making that a reality. Ed Crane remained the president for the balance of Ozark's existence, and was not always popular with the staff, but he was a pretty effective businessman and leader, and really did help Ozark reach the upper level of the local service airlines. So, going into the 1970s, kind of an interesting and amusing sidelight for Ozark was Hugh Hefner's Big Bunny. It was a long-range DC-9-30 that had been modified as a what should I say, a playpen for Hefner and his guests. And it was, how it came about, I don't know, but Ozark was selected to operate the plane. And it was actually operated under Ozark's airline operating certificate. And so Ozark pilots flew it. And Ozark trained their cabin staff, but they were not they were not flight attendants in the traditional sense. They were known as sky bunnies. Here is Hef in front of the airplane with 3 of the sky bunnies. But they did have to be trained as flight attendants to airline standards because it was operated under the airline operating certificate. But they also had to be trained to provide the various services that Hefner and his guests expected on board the airplane. And this is a picture of the interior of the airplane. Kind of what should we say? 60s kitsch styling, which you could kind of say applied to the whole Playboy routine. Here is Hefner's cabin at the rear of the airplane with this gigantic bed, which I think it said the dimensions were 6 feet wide by 8 feet long, where he lived when he wasn't interacting with his guests in the main cabin. And the jet bunnies, of course, had to attend to his needs and wishes back there. So that continued on until the mid to late 70s. What happened was that Playboy went public. So they now had stockholders and a board of directors, and it could not be used solely to satisfy Hefner's whims and wishes. And the Playboy board in 1976 decided that they didn't need the airplane anymore, and it was sold. So that was the end of the Ozark connection with Playboy. But it was kind of an interesting connection, if you will, between this fairly conservative Midwestern airline and Playboy, which in the 60s was the epitome of the sex revolution and all of the dramatic changes, social and political, that went on during that period. So Ozark, unfortunately, came out of the 1960s with debt and several years of losses incurred in acquiring the fleet that they had put together, and then they started rebuilding, did better financially during the 70s when much of the airline industry was struggling. But in 1973, Ozark had a rather sad and tragic setback when Flight 809 crashed on the approach to Lambert in July of that year. It was, there were 44 people on board, 38 killed. Remarkably enough, given the violence of the crash, 6 did survive, including the cockpit crew. It went down on the grounds of what is now the St. Louis UMSL. The circumstances were, there were thunderstorms in the area, a couple of planes had missed approaches prior to 809 on its approach, and the pilots went ahead and continued the approach flew into an area of intense rain, and they encountered a severe downdraft that literally threw the plane into the ground. It was the first of a number of accidents in the 70s that led to the identification and recognition of a phenomenon called microbursts that could occur under severe thunderstorms and that could, if encountered at low altitude and low speed, could literally lead to the loss of the airplane. There were some other losses. There was one down at New Orleans that I recall, and I think perhaps one at Houston as well. But 809 was really the first of that sequence that led to the identification of the phenomenon and then procedures to avoid them. And those accidents and those crashes then pretty much have gone away ever since then. On a more upbeat note, during the early 1970s, Ozark initiated a new class of meal service called flare service. This was the brainchild of a gentleman named Salvador Cristofoli, known to everybody as Chris, who was in charge of in-flight services. And Cristofoli got the idea of creating meals based on the meal service of European airlines. He apparently got that idea on a European trip, came back, sold to Ozark management, and so he developed this service, and it was quite popular, quite a hit, contributed to Ozark's success during the 70s. It also incorporated meal service based on domestic restaurants in the United States, and it was a definite plus for Ozark marketing and sales in the 1970s. Another in-flight service that proved to be pretty popular was the wine tasting program. And in this service, the flight attendants carried around little wicker baskets with bottles of wine that passengers could choose from. So with warm bread and cheese that they could put on it, and that was a hit also. And that kind of service and attention to passengers really contributed greatly to Ozark's success in the 70s, when most of the airline industry was struggling with skyrocketing fuel prices after the Arab oil boycott following the 1973 war between Israel and Egypt. But Ozark was doing pretty well during that period. But social and political and other changes were taking place in that period. As part of those changes, breaking down of gender stereotypes and so forth, Ozark began hiring male flight attendants in the 70s. I'm not sure if 1975 was the first year, but it was in that period of the mid-70s. And Ozark also acquired its first female pilot, a lady named Jackie. Then, of course, the thunderclap that struck the entire airline industry was deregulation, which had been in the offing for several years before that. Senator Kennedy held a series of hearings which were very favorable to deregulating the airline industry. And eventually the legislation was enacted, signed into law by Jimmy Carter in October of 1978. The legislation actually envisioned that deregulation would be phased in gradually, but a gentleman named Alfred Kahn was the head of the CAB at that time, a libertarian economist, and he was very anxious to do away with deregulation and pretty much swept everything away in one fell swoop. And the result, as those of you who were around then may recall, was a period of chaos in the industry. This slide is a picture of airline representatives lined up outside the CAB the day that, or the morning before the legislation went into effect, to be among the first to grab the new routes that were now available to them. No longer were routes or fares regulated or controlled as they had been rigidly by the CAB. Now it was a free-for-all, the Wild West, and not surprisingly, chaos ensued with airlines, long-established airlines like Braniff going under completely, folding up and being liquidated. But Ozark navigated through the deregulation period quite successfully, due in no small part to the quality of service that it offered to its passengers. And that allowed it to compete successfully with its big and increasingly significant rival in St. Louis, TWA. So Ed Crane continued enlarging Ozark's fleet during the 70s. And one purchase that he made was 3 stretch 727s. Here's a picture of one of them at the Boeing Field in Seattle in Ozark colors. Those were the new colors that were adopted at the time that the 72s were purchased. But no 727 ever flew a route for Ozark because Crane and Company quickly concluded that it was too big and not economical with 3 jet engines when there were planes coming along that could carry as many passengers on 2. So Crane turned around and sold the 72s to Pan American at a handsome profit, and making it, as has been said, Ozark's most profitable airliner. So by 1980 now, Ozark became an all-jet airline. The 227s, the Fairchilds, were replaced, were traded in. DC-3s, of course, were long gone, and so now Ozark was an all-jet airline, and they were operating only one type of plane, DC-9s of various marks. This is a Dash 30, which was the most common. But Crane and Company went all over the world to find economical DC-9s. Not all of them were bought new. Many of them were bought from other airlines, and eventually built up to a fleet of 50 variations on the DC-9 theme. also had a very successful charter operation. I just kind of used 1980 as a kind of arbitrary point to put it into the session here. Ozark started charter service, I believe, in 1969, and it was a very successful, profitable line of business for them. This airplane here, flying above the snow-capped mountains, is one of Ozark's 2 long-range DC-9-34s, I believe they were. They had extra fuel tankage and had an unrefueled range of over 2,000 miles. So they could do flights out of St. Louis to either coast, and also to destinations in the Caribbean. And Ozark had a pretty successful business vacation tour business to the Caribbean, using their long-range DC-9s. So Ozark was really coping pretty successfully with deregulation, more successfully than many. And by 1982, they were the number 2 player at Lambert, second only to TWA. The city built a whole new concourse D, that was really exclusively for Ozark's use. This picture with a telephoto lens, you can see all the Ozark planes lined up at the D concourse. 1982 was also the year that TWA, as part of its response to deregulation following in the national pattern, established a domestic hub for hub and spoke operations at Lambert. And so that unfortunately had the effect of putting Ozark and TWA on a collision course for the next several years. And Ozark was competing quite successfully with TWA, too successfully, as it turned out, because it meant, of course, that ultimately it had to be eliminated. So by 1985, now Ozark is really up there with the biggest. It is to the point where it had adopted another deregulation policy project, if you will, of having an arrangement with a commuter line. Now, Ozark was no longer serving the little cities that it had started out serving. It entered into an agreement with Air Midwest to form Ozark Midwest as its regional partner, and it now funneled passengers from the outlying areas to Lambert, to Ozark at Lambert. And also in 1985, Ozark took the next step, which was ordering the stretched MD-80, which was the ultimate stretch of the DC-9 series. Could carry up to 150 passengers, depending on how it was set up internally. And so it was, of course, carried as many passengers as the 727s that they didn't operate, with 2 more fuel-efficient engines than the 723. So Ozark now, of course, by 1985, is really head-to-head with TWA. They're really going after each other, hammer and tongs, for market share. And in that year, TWA was was spun off from its corporate parent that had been formed, Trans World Corporation. TWA was now an independent, publicly owned corporation. It was struggling. It was not doing well. Its stock was depressed, and so it became a target, excuse me, please, for corporate raiders. One of whom was Carl Icahn. The other was Frank Lorenzo, who had built up his airline empire based on Texas Air down in Houston. Both of them were interested in acquiring TW at its depressed stock valuation. And so a bidding war erupted between Icahn and Lorenzo in the summer of 1985. And the TWA's unions despised Lorenzo because of his union-busting tactics at Texas Air and Continental, which he controlled. And so, oops, didn't mean to do that, sorry. The union sided with Icahn, remarkably enough, and facilitated his ultimately getting control of the airline. Lorenzo's offer in dollar and cents terms was actually a bit more generous than Icahn, but the TWA unions were literally threatening violence if Lorenzo was allowed to acquire control. And so the unions paved the way for Icahn to take over. And of course, we know how that came out. So then, of course, as soon as Icahn got control of TW in early 1986 and broke a strike by the flight attendants, the TW flight attendants, his next order of business was to eliminate Ozark as a competitor, a too effective and successful competitor. And so in the fall of 1986, he made Lester Cox, an offer he couldn't refuse, and acquired Ozark for, in round numbers, about $220 million, I believe. Then, of course, typical Icahn fashion, he turned around, excuse me, sold all of the 50 Ozark jets and to a leasing company that he owned and controlled, and then leased them back to TWA, making a profit, of course, on both ends of the deal. Icahn, of course, was a master financial manipulator, but a terrible manager. Why he wanted to be the president of TWA and run the company, I don't understand, and I'm not sure too many others do either. But in any event, of course, we know what Carl did to TWA. But anyway, in the process, of course, Ozark, our hometown airline, disappeared into TWA and into Icahn's jaws. But it had a very successful run while it lasted. It was the last of the 13 local service airlines to get started. And it outlasted most of the others. It was one of the last left standing in 1986. I think the only ones that outlasted it were Piedmont and Allegheny, which of course ultimately then became American. So that's that in a nutshell is the story of Ozark, our little hometown airline. thanks for coming out and taking a look at it and listening, letting me talk about it for a few minutes.